Hello, everyone. We'll just give it 1 minute or so, just so everyone can attend, and we will begin very shortly. So as the numbers are increasing, we're looking forward to this webinar session. We have a great panel. I'll just do the intro and then we can begin. So hello everyone, welcome to this webinar. Use decentralized clinical trials to digitally enhance your patient engagement. We have an amazing panelist with us today, or panel today, and I will pass it over to our moderator, Barbara, who will intro, and we can then begin.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Usman, and welcoming everyone to this session today. My name is Barbara Velastro. I'm heading a patient insights and solution team at AstraZeneca. And it's really a pleasure for me to moderate today this panel with experts who will, this panel gathered by Reuters really brings experts to the table who have been designing, conducting clinical trials, and they'll share their learning with us, which is a fantastic opportunity for all of us to learn. I'd encourage you at the same time while I do the intro to get yourself familiar with the Q&A. Please say hello to the audience. Please use it to have questions. I will pull from them. Make sure your questions are directed to the right audience and the right panelist. What you can expect within the next hour is to hear from our panelists on 2 specific case studies that are going to be very interesting and inspiring. And also you'll hear about the development that are happening and the best practice happening in electronic data capture space. So again, don't hesitate to put any question in the Q&A. Welcoming again, thank you. I see something is happening. And I'll turn over, without further ado, let us start introducing the panel. I will ask each of you on the panel, please, to introduce yourself with your name, your function, and your role. So maybe I'll turn to you, Arash, first, if you would like to get us started.
Thanks very much for the introduction. And good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Arash. I am an academic pediatrician in London, and I work for Humour, which is a global digital health company headquartered in London. And in that role, I'm our global clinical director, where I oversee all of our evidence generation across a number of different projects, including 2 really exciting projects that I'm looking forward to our speakers sharing with you today.
Thank you. May I move to Rajesh?
Hi, everyone. I'm Rajesh Dash. I'm a cardiologist at Stanford, focusing on prevention. I'm also the director of the CardioClick telemedicine clinic in the cardiovascular medicine division here at Stanford. And lastly, I'm a co-founder of Health Pals, which is a digital health company in analytics. Today, I'll be presenting work on the DTAP study, which was a collaboration with Humour, but also exhibited some success in the decentralized trial space.
Thank you, Rajesh. May I pass to Kirsten?
Hi, I'm Kirsten Rennie. I'm an epidemiologist at the Medical Research Council Epidemiology Unit at the University of Cambridge. And similar as you just heard about the DTAP study, I'm presenting today the Finland COVID study, which we did in collaboration with Humour. And my work is very much on how we can apply the digital technologies into population-based studies and patient studies.
Thank you. And Joe, may I ask you to close the introduction round?
Thank you, Barbara. Joe Capillari from Pfizer, where I've been employed for the last 26.5 years. I'm an executive director of biostatistics and head of Pfizer's Health Economics and Outcomes Research Statistics Group, and I'm honored to be among you.
Thank you all. Thank you all for introducing yourself. And I think without further ado, I'm happy for all of us to start, digging down into the detail. And I would like to hand over to you, Rajesh, for the presentation so that you can walk us through the DTAP study, which is a completely virtual decentralized trial in patient with atrial fibrillation on oral anticoagulant. But you'll say all this much better than me, so I pass over to you.
Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to speak to everyone today. So yes, today I'll be talking about the insights we derived from a fully decentralized trial design in a cardiovascular clinical study. The DTAP study is an acronym for Decentralized Trial in Atrial Fibrillation. And let's get started. So one of the reasons that this project was even conceived of was because of pre-existing and then subsequently pandemic specific pressures on randomized clinical trials. We know that the cost of phase 3 clinical trials is untenable and rising at a rate that really we need to find new solutions that can actually make trials more efficient. Decentralized clinical trials represent one way that we believe we can accelerate recruitment and lower overall operational costs for trials. But in a cardiovascular setting, the decentralized clinical trial really has not been validated. I'll give one example in a moment where it was attempted, but there were some limitations to that that are important to note. So validating the depth, engagement with patients, and the technology that might be needed really needed to be done. And that was one of our major aims here. Subsequent to planning this trial, the COVID-19 pandemic hit, and actually this trial was able to proceed unimpeded during the early days in March 2020 of the trial, of the pandemic. So what's been done in cardiology in prior decentralized efforts? Well, really, there's been no MACE outcome trials and no double-blinded randomized clinical trials in the cardiovascular space to date. That is about to change. The one study that I mentioned before was the adaptable study, which was really drawn from a registry, the PCORNet registry, where they compared low and high dose aspirin. And there were some decentralized elements, but recruitment was not digital. The participant pool was really already partially recruited, and they didn't have very good engagement, partly because they didn't maybe have the stickiness of an app or something to that nature to keep those patients engaged. Only about 80% completed even half of the study visits, and there were lots of crossovers in the drug. They did look at MACE outcomes, but it was only 2 years, which is not long enough usually for MACE outcomes. So this was a great first step, but we really need more. So can you get a representative cohort to adhere to a decentralized protocol in a large or a small scale randomized clinical trial? That was really the major question of this study. Now, this study was sponsored by Bayer, and what you see here is the publication that came out earlier this year in Nature Digital Medicine. I encourage you to go and read more about the details of it. But the goals and objectives were to design and validate an integrated suite of digital health technologies to maximize recruitment, patient engagement, and data collection. Those were the primary endpoints. It was not about anything clinical. It was about patient engagement. Would they actually do this? Would they sign up? Would they complete the protocol, complete the visits? And I'll walk you through that protocol in a moment. It was in 55 and older patients who had atrial fibrillation on oral anticoagulation. And it was intended to inform a global phase 3 AFib randomized clinical trial with a DCT treatment arm. This would be the first medical intervention double-blinded randomized clinical trial that has a 100% decentralized arm. So the hypothesis was that this design would unlock efficiencies in recruitment, retention, and data collection. So what did we do? And so walk you through the protocol here. There were 2 parallel tracks of recruitment. The IRB here at Stanford forced us to use traditional recruitment initially with local referrals, manual chart reviews. We had a goal though, 100 patients to be enrolled in this trial. It was going to last for 6 months, but we wanted to recruit everyone within 4 weeks. There were some time constraints from both the sponsor and our own internal processes. So for 2 weeks, we were only allowed to do traditional recruitment. And about 2 weeks into the protocol, we were allowed to add social media recruitment California-wide to this protocol. Both groups of patients were directed to an online recruitment microsite that we generated that automated their eligibility screening, shown here, where they got basic information about the study, a 5-question pre-qualifying survey, and then also were directed, if they qualified per their report, to another site that would actually allow them to enroll in the study digitally. Now, they also had to upload a copy of their EKG or evidence of AFib. They also had to upload their prescription for an anticoagulant, so we knew that they were taking it. And if they did, they were sent both a link to the HUMA study app, which was the primary mechanism of communication for all aspects of the study. And they were sent 2 devices, an AliveCor 6-cell Cardia device, which produces a 6-lead EKG, and an Omron wireless blood pressure cuff. Those 2 devices paired with the HUMA app, and this is an example of the app where they could record blood pressures, EKGs, they could complete questionnaires, they could have asynchronous chats, they would get reminders and surveys, as well as education about their own condition. Over the next 6 months, they would complete weekly oral anticoagulation adherence surveys. And again, they would receive those notifications and education through the app. They would get 15-minute televisits, which could be done either by video or by phone every 4 to 6 weeks, roughly. And they would give study feedback. And as well, patient-reported adverse events, including nuisance bleeding, were collected. This lasted for about 6 months. And at the end of the study, there were post-study surveys. So what did actually happen? So as I mentioned, on August 5th, our IRB approved the protocol. We published the microsite for the study, which was a central site for both traditional and social media recruitment, but we only had traditional recruitment for 2 weeks. 2 weeks in, we had about 3 traditional patients in the study. We were getting pretty worried. The IRB released our social media campaign, and so we were able to launch that campaign. We saw a significant spike in hits to the microsite or the landing page for the trial. And actually in red dotted line, you're seeing the actual enrollment and consent for the trial, which is all digital, that started to rise. We actually stopped the campaign 6 days later because we thought we would overshoot our target of 100 patients. And then 2 days later, we relaunched, and with A/B testing, where we're able to optimize the ads that we learned from early on that were working the best, and found a dramatic spike in interest in the site. We actually had to turn it off again 2 or 3 days later. We actually over-enrolled for the trial, but 3 of these patients actually didn't have the right device for the trial. So luckily, we ended up with exactly 100 patients. But here's the interesting thing. In our waiting room, fully qualified, uploaded EKG information as well as prescription information, were 325 patients who were all eligible for the trial who could not make it in. This is an important point we'll come back to in a moment. So what happened? Over the course of the trial, there were certain things we did well and certain things we did not do well. Because we had a first come, first serve entry into the trial, we had the traditional biases we see in all clinical trials. It was almost entirely white population of patients who signed up. We had a pretty good spread of income level and education level. And most patients lived within 5 miles of their nearest clinic somewhere in California. So we weren't capturing super remote patients, but we were capturing patients who had access to care, but through this app, they didn't have to ever set foot in a clinical setting. There were roughly, as expected, the shown breakdown of anticoagulants that they were taking. And over those 6 months, we did patient activation measure scores, the PAM-13 score, and we found on average that patients did increase their engagement with their healthcare based on their survey results over the first 6 months. And in fact, over that same period, the number of patients who said they did not miss any doses of their medication started to rise. Now, this was not a significant overall effect, but in patients who actually had low oral anticoagulant adherence at baseline, those individuals did exhibit a significant improvement in their adherence to their medication. And they were getting reminders, weekly surveys to keep them on track. In addition, we had very high completion of the study visits, the study data collection, EKGs and blood pressures, and survey completion. We also had nuisance bleeding reported in fewer patients over time. Not sure of the significance of that, but interestingly, 82% of the patients who finished the trial said they were willing to join a DCT of 3 to 4 years duration with an investigational drug. This was very encouraging for us. So our conclusions were that decentralized trials can successfully recruit, retain, and engage subjects in a cardiovascular clinical trial, that social media recruitment is scalable and fast, and dedicated design modifications can dramatically improve diversity of a recruited enrolled cohort. And I say that because with 325 patients in a waiting room, roughly 10 to 12% of them were not white. And we could have prioritized, if that had been part of our dedicated design, those individuals to be through the door first. Now, this is an FDA mandate as of April of this year. So this is a tool that could help us achieve that. Now, there are challenges around data collection and event detection, but this can be mitigated with the right research coordination support, and I would say with the right engagement tools for the patient. Are they able to communicate with our team asynchronously or directly? And can they do that in a sticky way with something that really is something they feel ownership over in terms of their involvement in the trial? So we want to compare that traditional arm to that was done. We had 6 total patients that came in through there. We had 94 patients coming through social media. So those patients did roughly the same in this very small sample size, but at a larger scale, those should be compared. And we really believe that a combination of DCT and hybrid designs could be enabled with some of these technologies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rajesh. And we have, before we move to the next presentation, there are a few good questions in the chat. So apologies if I don't go through all of them, mainly for time reason, but I'm going to pick one or two, Rajesh, if you're okay. So the first one is really about the comment that this data is from 2020, and then came the restriction about Facebook ads. Do you have any reflection on that comment here?
Great point. So we didn't just use Facebook ads. We did use browser search histories from Google and other social media outlets. The Facebook restrictions do limit your ability to target to the granularity that you would like to. So for common conditions, I don't believe that is a major impact, but for rare conditions, I think it is. And I think for social media recruitment campaigns, rare diseases may not produce the yield that you really want. You're going to get a lot of noise. But for common conditions, because it's automated, because you can create filters and enrichment with surveys and even ask for verification, you may start with a bigger funnel, but you'll eventually get to the patients you want. And I will say that this is actually now part of an upcoming phase 3 that Bayer is running. Oceanic AF will have 10% of a 15,000 patient trial be decentralized. So that's what resulted from this trial.
Thank you for the answer, Rajesh. And I would invite you, there's several questions in the chat, maybe you can provide some answer, because I think I would like us to give also the opportunity to Kirsten, Joe, and Arash to follow up with their presentation. So Kirsten, I hand over to you for the Fen Lab COVID study.
Thank you. So I'm just being able to click through. Having a slight problem on click. There we are.
There we go. Good.
So I'm going to talk about the Finland COVID-19 study, which is a bit different to what you've just heard about DTaP. This is an observational study. And again, we're focusing on how we did on engaging the participants. So similar to what you've just heard, COVID-19 pandemic really accelerated that adoption of digital solutions and in population health as well. And when we look at engagement studies that have been published, most applications have been in patients that have chronic diseases, or they're in the acute COVID-19 patient monitoring field, or they've been looking at piloting the ability of engaging participants in clinical trials. There's very limited about how you engage people in population-based research outside of specific patient groups. So what I mean is a more general population recruitment. We were quite lucky in this study that we were recruiting from the Finland cohort, which is a longitudinal study where people have been involved for 15 years or so. So we were inviting people to take part in the Finland COVID study from that cohort. And it allowed us to really investigate not only how participants engaged, but also the types of people who are engaging, because we knew what the baseline group was. This wasn't like citizen science. We knew the denominator. And we were able to look at engagement at the outset, who consented to take part, the initial engagement, and the longer sustained engagement in the mHealth part of the Finland COVID study. So the Finland COVID study, people had the option of joining what we called the web-only arm, or an additional part, which was using the app. And to look at the app, we were able to draw on the quantitative data we had in the 2,500 people who took part in that app study over 6 months and more. And we conducted qualitative interviews in 35 participants who we purposefully sampled. And we sampled them not just on sociodemographics to get a good spread, but we also were able to sample them on the basis of how much they engaged. So we were able to recruit people who engaged a lot with the app or not so much, and also those people who didn't take part in the app study at all. So we could get a good spread of information there. So just to give you some background on the actual app study itself. So if people consented into the app study, they additionally were taking some extra measurements. And that was because we were really interested to understand the natural history of COVID-19 infection from the pre-symptomatic to the symptomatic stage. And for that, we asked people to take some additional measures using digital tools. So alongside what the whole group were doing of taking remote blood samples, we also asked them on the app to complete questionnaires, monthly baseline COVID questionnaire, and then monthly questionnaires for the length of time they were in the study. And also 3 times a week to take some measurements along with recording their symptoms. And we were able to align that then with national test results. What is really important to remember, this is 2020, everything was done completely remotely. We had no face-to-face contact with these participants. They were recruited using e-consent, and we sent out the devices, and they had to download the app themselves. So going on to the biomarker measurements, which is really what we're going to focus on in terms of engagement and how they engage with those, we sent everyone a thermometer and a pulse oximeter to take measurements themselves of their temperature and oxygen saturation, which they entered into the app. So that's quite important to note. This isn't like what you just heard in the DTaP. They weren't Bluetoothed to the app at this point in time, primarily due to practicalities, because in 2020, getting hold of these kinds of devices at scale was not particularly easy. They also did a measurement on the phone itself, putting their finger on the camera of the smartphone for 45 to 60 seconds to get a measurement of resting heart rate. And we asked them alongside that to also make a recording of their symptoms or no symptoms for 3 times a week. And so depending on when they started in the study, between August and October 2020, everybody was in the study for a minimum of 6 months, so between 6 and 9 months. And we asked them to complete those measurements 3 times a week. So what did we learn from that? Who did engage and what factors were associated with that engagement? Well, the first point is that over the 4,000 people who consented to take part, a high proportion of them, 2,500, consented to take part in the app study. And of those, over 90% were able to download the app and onboard and get started, which was a great success if you think that this was fully remote. And overall, as you see there, we had a really low withdrawal rate throughout the study. If you remember, this was over 6 months study. Very few withdrew, and then a few decided to drop out of the app study and move on to the web-only arm on the left-hand side. So thinking about the difference between those who decided to take part in the app sub-study versus those who decided to take part only in the web only, what we saw was it was slightly more men decided to take part, the higher proportion of men, people in higher SES groups. You can see there just 8% difference. A slightly higher amount of people had a university degree and were more likely to be working and living in a family household rather than living with a partner or alone. But what is important to see is between those two groups that took part in the app sub-study or the web only, there was no difference in self-rated health, and there was no difference between the groups of having a COVID-19 infection. So we weren't getting those people who were more motivated because they'd had an infection. I think an important point I'm sure we're going to come across a lot in the questions is about minimizing digital exclusion in these studies. And I think a really important learning for us was ensuring the technology platform is there. As you know, we worked with Humor on their bespoke app for this, and it was developed for both iOS and Android. Some studies have started with iOS only, and I think it's important to note here that in this study, we saw an almost 50-50 split between iOS and Android. And the other point that to make here is, as you see in this graph, we conducted the study in 2020, but the devices that people were using, if you look by release year, go back up to 5 years or more. And we did see a huge variation in makes and operating systems of devices. So I think you have to be careful not to think that people have the latest technology, the latest iPhone or Samsung. There's a whole variety of devices people may use. So moving on to the actual data of those biomarkers. On the left-hand side is resting heart rate, and on the right-hand side, temperature. And along the bottom axis there is the study week. So on average, people were in the study 35 weeks. And what we're looking at here is the proportion of people in blue who completed the measurements 3 times or more per week, which is what was in the protocol. In the gray, 1 to 2 times a week. And I think the main point to make here is the consistency, not only between those two measurements, but across the study. So you see a little dip at the end, which was when people weren't quite sure in the last week or so whether or not the study had finished. But overall, in the first 3 months and then the 3 to 6 month period, there was no difference in engagement. So we had very consistent engagement across the study. It also wasn't affected by lockdown periods. We don't see a difference between the 3 restriction periods that we had during the study, whether it was full lockdown, part lockdown. There was no difference there, which you can imagine might have been a factor in terms of how people were thinking about the pandemic and COVID-19. And we saw no difference in the times when people were entering that they had symptoms or no symptoms between those. So there wasn't a drive that if they thought they might have symptoms that they would engage more. There was no difference. But the other point I want to make here is we suggested to people, well, first of all, we told them to do it first thing in the morning, but we suggested that they maybe did the measurements on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And we certainly saw a peak on every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday where most people were entering their data. Once people got into a routine, they really stuck with it. So if there's a possibility of establishing a routine in your active data collection, I think that's a really positive point to do. And you see there in the quote there from one of the qualitative interviews that once they got into a routine, it made it very easy. This is the graphs of the other 2 measurements. On the left-hand side, you see oxygen saturation. Very, very similar to the previous 2 and the same results in terms of consistency across. But on the right-hand side, you see the proportion of people who completed the symptoms. And you see that those that are completing it 3 or more, there's a substantial drop there in comparison to the oxygen saturation. And when we looked into this more with the qualitative work, it was clear that many users were reporting that, well, because I didn't have any symptoms, I just didn't enter anything. Though there was the option, as well as selecting the symptoms you had to select no symptoms, and we had asked people to do that, it does show that if the most common answer is a no response, many people just choose not to engage with that question. So that was a definite learning for us. So if we look at the long-term engagement, the engagement over that 6-month plus time period, we looked at the different sociodemographics and the information we collected. And higher engagement, much to my surprise, was very much associated with being one of the older members of the population. So this group were adults between 45 and 70, and it was very much that older 65 plus group that engaged the most. And they often weren't working because they were retired. But an interesting point was the engagement was higher in people in more middle socioeconomic groups, not the highest socioeconomic groups by occupation, but the middle ones there. And they were less likely to be categorized as depressed if they were in that higher engagement group. So there was a definite association with the measures we were making on mental health. But positively, we didn't see any relationship with engagement between differences in men and women, or with education, or where they lived, particularly no relationship in whether or not they lived in a deprived area, or self-rated health or physical function, or any of the health conditions that we measured, or having a COVID-19 infection. So we're quite positive there in terms of it's not related to some of the health outcomes that we were measuring. And another point within this whole being older that we really got back from the qualitative was that older participants during this pandemic became more accustomed to using technology. And so we did see in their responses that they felt much more digitally literate than they perhaps felt before the pandemic. I want to just touch on a couple of other points that we found. This is in relation to the heart rate monitor as the example. So the heart rate measurement is not heart rate monitor, it's the measurement on the phone. We did find some people had a few problems. For example, smartphones often have a few cameras and not knowing which one to use and where to put their finger. So we did have to provide additional instructions as we went through the study. In the first couple of months, very much thinking about different ways of giving people information, whether it be written or a short video to show them how to do it. And that's something we did get back from the qualitative research as well. But there's also the option where you can give feedback to a participant on the measurements that they're taking. That was really valued, that people liked being able to see their resting heart rate graphs over time and being able to look at that for themselves and monitor it for themselves. And I appreciate that's not always possible in studies, and you don't want it to affect the integrity of the studies or the outcomes. But where there is that possibility, we definitely saw that improved people's engagement. So I've given some of these points in the slides that I've gone through, but in our publication on this study, which will be published soon and is currently in preprint, we've developed a checklist from our learnings from the qualitative and quantitative work. And I think just to draw the 2 points that I haven't perhaps drawn over in the previous slides is about the digital exclusion and really testing how you download the app, how you complete the onboarding process and test that with users, which is really important, as well as making sure the platform works across different devices. And we've certainly learned the importance of collecting both qualitative and quantitative data to monitor engagement all the way through the study, as well as at the end. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Kirsten. And before we open up for more of a panel discussion, I would like to pull one of the questions from the audience, Kirsten, to you around, did you manage to collect the reason why people dropped out in the study?
No, unfortunately not. Some of them, it was to do with the upload on Android and them getting confused. So I think that's a learning for us to make sure that if they do need to rejoin, that we have better instructions on that. But unfortunately, no, we didn't on why they withdrew. But it was a low number, so yeah, we'll definitely collect that in the future.
No, thank you. And that's actually a perfect segue for my next question to Arash, because Yuma was highly involved in both studies here. So my question to you is, it was very clear there was good patient engagement, good adherence, good learnings, good recommendation from Kirsten here at the end. So what are the takeaways from your side, from a mobile health perspective and technology, and where do you think we're heading into transforming, engagement in trials? Would you like to comment on that?
Sure. I think the first thing to really reflect on both these studies is the fact that we are scrutinizing and generating the evidence underpinning these platforms. I think it's really easy to forget that, yes, DCT and hybrid models are really exciting, but we've got to generate that evidence. And actually, if we look across the industry, I think there was a figure over the summer, something like 46% of companies involved in digital health don't publish and haven't generated any evidence related to the tools and platforms and solutions they provide. And I think from our perspective at Huma, one of the key things that we want to do collectively and also individually, certainly those of us who are involved in research at the company, was to generate that evidence and to work and collaborate and do trials like this. So I think the first thing is, it's great that we're doing this. I really want things like this to be the norm going ahead. I'm really excited for some of the collaborations that we've got going ahead with these and other partners. But I think the two real main reflections from both these studies, the commonalities, is that you've got to be, in the first instance, patient-centric. And the second aspect is you've got to really make sure that you're doing everything you can to make this as easy to use as possible to reduce those barriers. So when it comes to being patient-centric, there was a quote there that I really liked, which was a patient who talked about actually making this a part of their routine. And I think in order for these things to work, we've got to make it easy for these patients, but we've also got to demonstrate to them what the value in this is. So I think from us as a supplier, we spent a lot of time thinking about what does the design look like? How is it from the patient experience? And then also thinking about what value does this bring to the participants? And the second thing that I was talking about was kind of that piece around making sure this is easily accessible. And this chimes in with the bit about health inequalities. I think digital is really exciting. It's not going to be for everyone, but I think what we have to do is make sure that we reduce the barriers as much as possible. That's through good design, that's through nice kind of flows, that's again through making it clear to people what the value is for them. This has to very much be a choice. We can't force this on people, but I think if we do that, then there's some really encouraging signs. So we talk a lot about digital exclusion in the older cohorts, but we've actually seen some examples here of where if you design things really well and you engage people really well, actually older cohorts are some of the groups of individuals who would really like to take part in these kinds of research. And that's really similar to what we're seeing also in the healthcare space. In a number of our healthcare deployments, we're often seeing older individuals get a smartphone for the first time, use some of the products that we have, and actually being really happy because it's a much more convenient and pleasant way for them to interact with their care. And so as we start to think about how we diversify trials, I think it's got to be about making it easy and accessible for everyone. And I think these two studies are a really great example of that. But my call would be, let's do more of this. Let's generate that evidence. Let's build that learning. Let's collaborate and share the findings, and let's try and build these solutions that are reflective of what everyone needs.
Yeah, you're touching on a very good point around the benefit. What's in it for me? What's in it? That's going to be key, and to the engagement. Otherwise, yeah, people might not engage as much as we want them to. But I think I would like to bring Joe now in this conversation, because in both study, one of the key element is about patient were required to engage with the device, to enter data, to be either self-reported or if there was a manual element to entering data. And Joe, I would like you to if you would like to comment on what are the development happening in this space to optimize data capture. There's a lot of consortium of groups looking at this, merging the data piece with the decentralized components. So I would like to let you comment on that.
Yes, thank you, Barbara. Yes, you're right. Over the last several years, there have been publications on how we could optimize electronic capture of clinical outcome assessment data in clinical trials. I'll point one such article published in Therapeutic Innovation and Regulatory Science, which is the official journal of the Drug Information Association. Fleming and colleagues, who are members of the ePro consortium at the Critical Path Institute, published a paper in 2015 to describe study site, subject, and technology. I've taken notes to make this more efficient and relevant. Technology-related factors that may lead to deviations from the planned electronic collection of PRO data. And in doing so, providing recommendations at preventing potential problems or quickly resolving them. A general issue, for example, is site-based data entry, and a specific issue associated with that is site acceptance of and compliance with ePro data collection. The authors recommend to include electronic data capture requirements in the protocol, provide timely and adequate training, and to allot appropriate amounts of time for subjects to complete training and questions. A lot of these recommendations are common sense. Another specific issue on data site entry is scheduling of subjects at a study site based on the availability of the ePro device, and estimate the number of devices needed at the site, have the backups available and to reschedule subjects if there are no alternatives. Another related issue has to do with modality challenges. Again, having those backups available, rescheduling subjects if there's no alternative, and systematic and thorough testing of the system prior, to have push software upgrades, stay current, and to have web interface available as a backup. And finally, with the field-based data entry, there are a couple specific issues associated there. One of them has to do with subject acceptance of and compliance with ePro data, and the recommendation here is to use usability testing, include language in informed consent forms, evaluate adherence with ePro data collection, program audible alerts, and to alert sites if non-compliance or missing data is identified. There is also having training materials available, 24-hour help desk, and requiring subjects to complete training on the device. And finally, Barbara, I'd like to point out, given the subjective nature of these questionnaires, that we want to make sure that they're valid and reliable. A paper published in Value in Health 2018 by Byron and Collins, again on behalf of the ePro consortium at the Critical Path Institute, has published a paper giving what's needed for validity and reliability of these measures, these self-reported measures. So Byron and colleagues, Value in Health 2016, I encourage our participants to check it out.
Thank you, Joe. And I will pick a question on the chat to follow up on the data collection, and maybe I'll ask also Arash to comment on this one, because it's related to the technology. How do we troubleshoot technical problem? How does that affect real-time data collection? So I'm wondering, Arash, is this something you could comment on around that element of technical troubleshooting? Is this, I think there was some comments about 24/7 hotline in Kirsten's study. So any comment on that from a human or technology perspective?
I think troubleshooting is something that you are going to have to do and have to have support services for. So as a company, we have a customer success department that exists, but I think actually taking a step further back from that, I think one thing that's really important to bear in mind is, if you're going to ask so many people to use a piece of software, there is something about making it simple enough and obvious enough that yes, you provide those resources, but it really shouldn't be something you have to go and research and spend ages looking it up. So if I think about the bits of software that I use every day that are really successful, yesterday, for example, I ended up breaking my earphones. I had to order some new earphones. It took me about 2 minutes on Amazon on my app to order some new earphones in. And I think I didn't need a manual to use that. It was all relatively easy.
Yeah.
I think that's the level of ease that we really should be aspiring for. That's not going to happen overnight. It's going to happen through a lot of understanding both the qualitative and the quantitative of how people are interacting, who's finding things useful, who's finding things challenging, using that to then iterate and improve. But also, I think actually taking a landscape view and looking around the industry and seeing what works. So software is something that innovates all the time, regular updates. In the vast majority of cases, actually, the way that works is that product and design teams come together, share ideas. What we've tried to do at Humour is try and bring in some of the evidence into that and to inform that from a scientific perspective. So one example, about 2 months ago, we were debating about a specific change to our product about slightly tweaking the visualization that we would give to patients about their data, sort of mimicking what clinicians and researchers see. And there were 2 schools of thought on this. And rather than kind of have a debate about it, we decided to go out to the scientific literature and see what similar things have done. And so we ended up doing quite a quick literature review, but we ended up synthesizing about 400 different articles looking at what people have found regarding this change or similar changes. And actually, we got quite a lot of rich data from that, a lot of learning from the system. So yes, absolutely. In terms of the reactive stuff, got to have those systems in place. But actually, where I would love us to be is to be in that proactive space where the design minimizes that. And I'm not saying that we've solved all of that, but I think both these projects give us really good examples of some of that learning, what went well, what things are improving, to try and get to the point where ideally we don't need to be training people for that. Obviously provide that information, but I really want us to be in a place where these things are intuitive.
Yeah.
No, I agree. Joe, you want to comment?
Yeah, that Arash has inspired me to make the following comment. The next step, the next chapter would be intervention trials. Well, whether we want to see if the treatment works, and a burning topic is what is a meaningful within patient change on the wearable, on the digital technology. Whether it be steps, moderate physical activity, what are we going to measure? What is meaningful on that measurement? And in that spirit, the Drug Information Association is going to have a webinar on digital health technology and meaningful change on a week from today, December 8th, and it's a nice complement to this this conference. So. Meaningful change on wearables, digital technologies is a nice extension, something maybe we'll regroup and get together to discuss it at another conference.
Thank you. Thank you both for building on each other. I would like to just, if we go back to the DTaP study and the Finland study, Rajesh and Kirsten, I have a question for you around which barrier do you think was minimized in your respective patient population by using the decentralized trial? So is there any, we know there's several barriers to engaging with clinical trial from a patient perspective. So if I start with you, Rajesh, which barrier do you think was most minimized, if I can say it that way?
I think there's an activation energy needed for patients to join a clinical trial. And I think that in DTaP, by having really 2 key elements, we were able to overcome that barrier, which is, a targeted social media campaign that was successful, but also a easy to onboard platform for the study. So that platform provided a portal to everything they needed. And I think that it made it very easy for them to schedule, to talk, to communicate. I think if you lower that activation energy for patients to get into a study and you raise awareness at a scale with social media about the study, you can accelerate recruitment and onboarding, and it facilitates all your operations downstream. Now, it sounds simple, but it was not a simple process, and it was a very difficult one. But I think that we learned a lot. But that was probably the biggest barrier that we felt we overcome.
So making it easy to find, yeah.
Easy to find and easy to get in. Yep.
And yeah, Kirsten, what about you?
Yeah, I think there are two, not necessarily related to Finland because we couldn't see people during that, but often people come for a lengthy clinical visit where they're completing lots of questionnaires and screening things. And I think in today's world now, we've got very used to completing forms before an appointment online before we go, and it really shortens, if we need to do a face-to-face clinic visit, it shortens it down quite considerably, which I think opens it up to a new group of people who perhaps didn't think they had time to come to a clinic visit, whether it's they're working or they have caring responsibilities. I think it opens that up more because the time limitation's not there, particularly things like completing medications, that if you've got all your medications around you at home, it's so much easier to enter that sort of information at home. And the other point is the ability to collect frequent short questions, really important for things like patient-reported outcomes, potential adverse events, the ability to capture those at regular time points, whereas often we've got long gaps between our follow-ups in trials. And so there's that ability for that more constant contact.
Yeah. Yeah, and Barbara, what we're hearing now from Kirsten and Arash, as well as Radesh, is this momentum that we have that has made its way, for example, from the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, which is this body that has recommended and provided guidance on digital health technology regarding developing novel endpoints, selecting a digital health technology, testing it, and also case studies, Parkinson's disease, heart failure, diabetes, Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and others. And now we have 2 more case studies to add to the knowledge base.
No, I agree. I completely agree with you. Maybe I should ask also Arash about, minimizing barrier from a technology perspective. It was very interesting to hear some data about older patient. I saw some reaction also in the question that was maybe not expected. So any technology reflection on barriers?
I think I've already mentioned some of the sort of user interface elements. I think a second thing, and sometimes this is overlooked, is just to make sure, especially if you're going to scale these things, and especially if you're talking about different geographies or different resource settings, is making sure whatever software you provide can be hosted on multiple bits of hardware. So I see a lot of papers that seem to be exclusively hosted on iOS, when vast majority of the world will be on Android or other platforms. Often those phones are cheaper. That's an important consideration. It's also really important to make sure that your software isn't going to be just restricted to the most recent phone. So we have all these figures about smartphone penetration, but we sometimes forget that for many people, that device might be 5 or more years old. So we're going to digitally exclude those people if you can't build software that those devices can host as well. And so when we're thinking about some of the newer technologies we're trying to introduce, so for example, new biomarkers that we can try and measure through the smartphone, one of the things that we always ask ourselves as a team is thinking about actually what's feasibly the lowest quality hardware we can use to build on this, because we want to include as many people as possible. And you saw the graph in this study of looking back actually how old some of these devices were. And then when it comes to the different geographies as well, I think there is a challenging thing about making sure things are going to be compatible with different systems, different cloud systems. That's a kind of a system level issue, but it's another thing that if we're going to scale things like remote monitoring or decentralized trials, particularly if we want these trials to have great validity because they're getting patients from multiple geographies, that's another problem that we're going to have to square. So really, I think the key behind this is going to be configurability. Are you device agnostic? Are you cloud agnostic? And then actually for the variety of different trials that you want to do, because your guidelines might vary from one country to the next, can you very rapidly configure these protocols rather than push out a series of point solutions? I think those are the things technology needs to answer. And it's what we're certainly trying to do at Huma. Again, I'm not saying that we've cracked everything yet, but I think it's a really important philosophy, and I'm really excited for what that future holds.
Thank you. And I think there's a good question in the chat that I would like to maybe let's see who would like to pick it up first, but it's about collecting consent and personal data from international participants. And I think this is something where privacy, GDPR. So who would like to take a first stab at this one from an international perspective? Maybe I turn to Rajesh or Kirsten. One of you would like to have a go at this?
I'll start. I probably know less than Kirsten does about this, but I feel like there are definitely stricter regulations in the EU about patient privacy and patient data collection. Our efforts obviously have been focused mostly in the US, but which also has its regulations. But I think that probably you need to have something more unifying for the EU if there is a way to do that. I would definitely love to hear, Kirsten's experience with that.
With the UK, yeah.
I only have the UK perspective. I'm afraid I haven't done studies outside of the UK, but we definitely have to limit personal information going outside of our own systems. So everything is done on a participant identifier, and wherever possible, we're limiting any personal identifiable data outside of our contact with people. And you've got to be so careful where the data flows are, where data is being held. And Arash will and I've worked very hard on working on that, and how the data is held securely, and personal identifiable data is held away from the measurements and securely separated. So and it has to, yes, be held within the EU.
Yes. Good, thank you. I was going to give Arash maybe the opportunity, since you've worked across several studies, probably globally as well. Do you want to have a final comment before we wrap up?
No, I was going to say that there's obviously the technical side of this, and that you've got to abide by different regulations. And I think there is a challenge, and there's a lot of work when it comes to matching up countries that have different regulations. What we find from experience is it's usually easiest to work with the country that has the most stringent regulations, and then plan that out across. I guess the point I really want to make is that it's not just a tick box exercise, because a huge part of this is trust. I think we sometimes forget that these trials are only going to be born if patients are willing to share that really rich insight of that data. And that's only going to happen if they trust. And so, yes, there's the technical aspects of making sure that your information governance and your cybersecurity is spot on. I think there's a huge part also about the conversation, explaining to people why it is that we're collecting this data, what is the potential insights that we're trying to gather. And I think about the parallel to research, and this happens a lot in pediatrics. And I find even in that setting, no one generally tends to decline taking part in research and sharing bits of their data once you've taken the time to explain what it is you're trying to do, why it might be of benefit, and actually how they can help. And I think one of the things that was, I don't know if we mentioned that, but was really nice about the project that we did with the University of Cambridge is actually we had a session afterwards where we showed some of the participants what we actually did with that data. And I think that's a really nice part of the conversation. It's not just we're doing this study on you or, at you, we're doing it with you, and this is what you contributed, and this is the new insights. And I think the feedback from that, Kirsten, correct me, was really positive, and I'd love to see more of those kind of things when we do more and more decentralized trials.
And I think there's the opportunity through the app as well to keep that conversation going. So being able to feed back to the participants via the app what's happening with their data and the research that's going on is so valuable. They feel part of a bigger whole.
I think, Kirsten, you just summarized it so well. I see that time is running really quickly. This hour just flew by. Very good discussion. Thank you. A lot of activity in the chat. I would invite all the panelists, to answer the questions that we have. I think, what are the key success to engaging? I liked what you said here, Arash. Trust. We need to make sure that, we get the trust so that patients engage in the future. And it sounds like decentralization is the future. So on that, I would like to thank all the panelists for today. And maybe I'll let Usman close for us.
Yeah, thank you very much, Barbara. And brilliant webinar, very insightful, great insights. And for those who may have missed the start, and for those who haven't attended, we will send a recording next week, so you can revise and look at the insights again, because I'm sure there was a lot of good information which needs a bit of time to digest. So yeah, we'll send a recording next week. Thank you very much, Kirsten, Barbara, Joe, Rajesh, and Arash, for your time and your thoughts. And thank you all for attending, and we will send you the recording next week. In the meantime, have a great rest of the week and a wonderful weekend.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you very
much.
much. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.